Thank you for joining us on Idaho State of Mind, where we endeavor to educate the citizens of Idaho on the state of higher education. I'm Libby Howe. This is a production of Idaho State University, and we are proud that the majority of the show's content is created by ISU Mass Communication students. On today's show, we will discuss the sensitive topic of suicide. Family members who have survived the death of a loved one through completion of suicide face a hurtling change in life. We talked to one mother about the devastating loss of her son to suicide and how she is turning her devastation into hope for others. That's coming up later in the show. But first, we've all heard the buzzwords: global warming, climate change, ozone layer. Idaho's universities are teaming up to tackle this problem of global proportions. Attempting to cover a topic of such magnitude requires disciplines across the board to join forces. Researchers at Idaho State University, along with Boise State University and the University of Idaho, are working on multiple projects. All have the goal of understanding the effects climate change will have on Idaho. It's all being done with a 5-year, $15 million grant from the Experimental Program to Stimulate Competitive Research, commonly known as EPSCoR. Today's show will explore the variety of studies being done to tackle this issue. Researchers are currently in the 3rd year of this 5-year study. To help us better understand why Idaho is so interested in climate change and why it's so important, joining us today is ISU Associate Professor of Biological Sciences, Dr. Colden Baxter. He is the lead scientist in ecological studies for the EPSCoR grant. And Dr. Baxter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Now, there are a wide variety of disciplines that are involved in this EPSCoR grant. Can you tell us the scope of what this grant entails?
Right. So climate change, often that phrase is linked to global. It's a big problem. It's a big issue, and it takes a community of scientists working together to tackle it. And so there are researchers from a variety of disciplines working on the climate change problem in all different parts of the world. But here in Idaho, our community, the community of scientists to address this issue have been relatively limited in the past. One of the major focal points of this grant has been to build that community. And in particular, through either the creation of new researcher positions. Nearly a dozen new positions have been created at the 3 universities, for example, filling gaps in expertise, but also building community by bringing people together who might not otherwise be working together, and building, catalyzing really that synthesis and synergy.
And from what I understand, you have kind of the people you would expect, like biologists and ecologists, but there are other disciplines that you wouldn't expect to be in this at all.
Right. For instance, we're working with social and social scientists and economists. Climatologists are working with ecologists, and so on. So.
Great. Now, why is Idaho such an ideal place to study climate change? I mean, this is a big grant, so there must have been a reason why they thought it should come to Idaho.
Right. Well, for one, we, as a state, we have some unique facets of our geography, I think, that help set the stage for investigations that are both needed here to address major applied problems that are important to the West, but also that provide a context within which major discoveries may be made. So, for example, the Snake River Plain and its aquifer are the site of, some of the fastest growing industrial agriculture in the western U.S. And this is an area of intense importance to the nation from an agricultural standpoint, and how we manage water and how climate affects that linked human ecological and climatological system is going to be really critical. That provides a really unique opportunity. Another key opportunity is just to the north of there, the Salmon River Basin is one of the largest unregulated river systems, undammed river systems in the lower 48 states. And there we have the potential to use that basin as a natural laboratory, a window into how climate change may be affecting ecosystems and physical processes in ecosystems.
So we really have both extremes then. We have
That's right.
something that's highly regulated and something that's wilderness, and we can see how man is affecting it without actually being there. That's great. Now we're going to be going over a lot of these different studies that are in this EPSCoR grant. Thank you so much for coming today and talking to us about this program.
You bet. Thank you.
And a very important part of the EPSCoR grant is studying the effects climate change will have on every aspect of the environment. Dr. Colden Baxter has jokingly referred to two of his graduate students working on these studies as fire and ice. Idaho State of Mind's Ellie Spencer shows us the two extremes of the environmental spectrum these students are studying.
Fire, 23-year-old Hannah Harris. She's studying the potential effects of wildfire along the South Fork Salmon River Arm on the edge of the Frank Church Wilderness area. Meet ice, 24-year-old Ryan Blackadar. He's studying the interactions between river ice and organisms in the Big Creek within the boundaries of the Church Wilderness. Both of these Idaho State graduate students have access to some of the biggest labs in Idaho, the vast Idaho wilderness. And both are doing important research that gives a deeper insight into climate change in Idaho.
We have a lot of great water in Idaho, and the Salmon River is a great resource. And so understanding the dynamics of this natural system is important, especially when we're trying to manage the system.
Harris's goal is to better understand how prescribed fires affect the environment in comparison to wildfires.
The frequency and the intensity of fire is predicted to increase as the climate warms. So understanding how fire impacts streams and how that can impact entire river networks is important.
With the erosion caused by wildfires, more sediments can end up in the river, and this causes the water to hold less nutrients. Less nutrients means the water can't support as much life. Understanding this complete circle of events is part of Harris's ongoing research. Blackadar's study is a little less heated and much colder. Past research shows that the amount of ice in the river can affect more than one aspect of it, from the amount of algae on a stream bed to how many fish a river can support, and even the predator-prey relationship between wolves and deer.
Ungulates like deer and elk and sheep, they can be pursued and killed by wolves on the river ice. But when there's no river ice, it's actually like a sanctuary.
Blackadar is helping to collect and interpret the data on this subject.
You know, it's really fun to collect all these samples out in the field, but then when you bring them back inside, it's a lot of time.
Insight on how ice affects these organisms gives Idaho another piece of the climate change puzzle. Ellie Spencer, Idaho State of Mind.
Both of these students continue to collect and interpret data for their projects. Researchers at ISU's Boise Center Aerospace Laboratory are using remote sensing technology to monitor a changing climate. Center Director Dr. Nancy Glenn says remote sensing is like taking a DNA fingerprint of the Earth's surface.
What we're interested in is finding out, being able to discriminate different targets on the Earth's surface. And so we can use sensors that are mounted on a tripod, mounted on an unmanned aerial vehicle or a drone, on a satellite or an airplane or a helicopter that can measure the electromagnetic radiation or the reflectance of different targets on the Earth's surface.
Thanks to remote sensing, scientists have compiled a 40-year history of the Earth's surface dating back to the 1970s. They're able to compare those images to more recent images to see if a changing climate is impacting vegetation or water availability. Much like the rings of a tree stump, coring down into rock beds and inspecting sediment samples can give researchers insight into the environmental history of an area. ISU professor Bruce Finney and his colleagues are using this technique to study climate change in Idaho. Idaho State of Mind's Deanne Coffin has the story.
Professor Finney specializes in coring down into lake bottoms, taking out sediment samples, and interpreting layers of sediment using a sophisticated instrument called a mass spectrometer.
What we would typically do with a core like this is take actual samples out of it to sample the different layers going all the way down, and then we'll do various kinds of analyses of samples to learn about the history of the lake.
To determine drought periods, they look at indicators of water chemistry within the sediment samples. The drier periods correspond with higher concentrations of elements, such as those found in salt. Wetter periods have less evaporation, and samples feature lower concentrations of salt indicators.
For example, we can analyze pollen from the sediments to learn about how the plants have changed. We can find little pieces of charcoal in the layers to talk about how often fires have come. And we can do certain kind of measurements in an instrument called a mass spectrometer.
The mass spectrometer can give us information about the sediment samples.
What that does is it measures the different kinds of oxygen and carbon and nitrogen in a core, and the different levels of those elements tell us about, they vary depending on different conditions in the lake environment.
Reporting from Idaho State University, Deanne Coffin, Idaho State of Mind.
Professor Finney says human influence on the climate is going to be stronger in the future, and they are trying to predict what changes might occur. Idaho geologists are concerned climate change affects the flood characteristics of the state's rivers. They have developed a novel study involving rocks in Idaho's Salmon River.
Specifically, Idaho is important for salmon, different species of salmon, and by understanding how areas that are warming and have more rain, how their beds move and how frequently their beds move will give us an understanding of whether or not Idaho will continue to be the excellent habitat for salmon that it has throughout the past.
The geologists inserted electronic tags into rocks before throwing them into the Salmon River. Wands are then used to find the tagged rocks, which gives them an idea of the flood movements. After seeing the results of this study, ISU researchers feel this experiment is appropriate for many other rivers in the Northwest. The Arctic is the hot spot, so to speak, for the effects of climate change, climate change is having on the Earth. Idaho State of Mind Sean Forey shows us how one ISU research team is hoping to study the effects of permafrost melting. Take a look.
It's no secret big changes are happening as we speak to the Earth's climate. At ISU, geologists are working to see why permafrost is melting at such a high rate of speed.
Permafrost is essentially a glue that holds everything together. When the pore spaces between sediment are filled with water and they freeze, it holds all that sediment in place. And as that ice or that frozen water starts to thaw, then that's no longer holding that sediment in place, and it makes landslides happen more frequently.
Dr. Crosby and a team of colleagues and students travel almost annually to northern Alaska to study the effects permafrost is having on the environment. The mudflow from this thaw slump has been polluting rivers, which affects local communities in terms of fresh water for drinking and fishing. But the big question is, can it be stopped?
Stopping it is not really an option. What's a more important thing is to know is how fast are the changes occurring, where in the landscape are the changes occurring, and how do we adapt to those changes.
Sean Forey, Idaho State of Mind.
Over the last 40 years, there has been a 200% increase in thaw slumps. Currently, there are thousands of known thaw slumps around the world. An ISU assistant biology professor helped build and design a tower equipped with sophisticated instrumentation to assist with climate change studies. The 70-foot tower is located near Island Park on the banks of the Henry Fork of the Snake River. The tower measures how the Earth dissipates sunlight energy. These sites are examining how much radiation translates into heat going into the soil compared to that going into the air. For more information on all of these Idaho climate change studies, you can go to idahoclimatechange.org. As the state-designated provider of health professions education, Idaho State University brings us Healthy State of Mind, a segment dedicated to all things health-related. We start today's health segment with the second leading cause of death in Idaho's young people, suicide. Idaho State of Mind's Summer Geock joins us live in the studio with more. Summer, I understand mental illness can play a major role in high suicide numbers.
That's right, Libby. The Center for Substance Abuse Treatment states 90% of people who do complete suicide experience a mental or substance abuse disorder. I sat down with Jenny Griffin, a mom who lost her son to suicide 8.5 years ago. She wanted to share her story, bring awareness to save lives, and to offer hope.
The morning that I found him kind of catapulted our family into a whole new experience. It was really devastating to think that our bright, happy child would choose to take his own life.
Todd Michael Griffin was a 16-year-old sophomore in high school. He completed suicide on April 25, 2003.
Some of the signs that he probably was exhibiting, we just thought he was being a teenager. A little bit of anxiety being in high school and starting to date and getting his driver's license and, getting that high school thing all figured out. But now, after his passing, we've been able to look back and recognize a lot of the warning signs.
Some of the warning signs Jenny remembers includes lack of eating, declining grades, anxiety, and becoming less social. Jenny believes her family really started to heal when they joined a support group. The Suicide Prevention Action Network, also known as SPAN, is a volunteer organization created in 2006. Jenny chose to become an advocate, educating people about suicide. She travels throughout southeast Idaho sharing her story.
But because of what we've been through, what I've been through, I'm more educated about it now. And I just feel that that's become my cause in this life, is to be able to help others, to provide that hope for somebody that might be at risk. And I don't want any other family to have to go through what our family's gone through.
Her training sessions last about an hour and cover topics such as myths, warning signs, questions to ask, where and how to find help.
There's that myth that always goes along with, if they're going to talk about it, they're not going to do that. That's absolutely not the case. If they're going to talk about it, they are really contemplating it. And also the fact that people really don't want to die. They really want help.
Better Todays, Better Tomorrows is another resourceful organization brought to the public through Idaho State University's Institute of Rural Health. They offer free training for the community that provides the latest scientific information on topics concerning suicide.
I can go home at the end of a training or a conference that I've been to and know that I've helped educate somebody to know what those warning signs are. I wish that I would have had that, and that I would have been able to recognize the things that caused Todd to make the decision to leave us. And I do this in honor of him.
In 2010, 290 people died by suicide in Idaho. If you see a friend or a family member having an abrupt change, sit down with them, listen, ask them questions. Persuade them that there is always hope and that you do want them around for holidays and celebrations to come, and refer them to a resource. Libby?
Thank you, Summer. Anyone who may be dealing with suicidal thoughts can find help by calling the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Call 1-800-273-TALK. Help is also available at your local mental health facility or counselor. Suicide is a deeply emotional and complex subject. Joining us today from the Idaho Public Television studios in Boise, Ann Kirkwood. She directs the Youth Suicide Prevention Program at ISU's Institute of Rural Health. Ann, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for asking me.
Suicide is a much bigger problem in Idaho than I think most people probably realize. Where does Idaho rank in compared to other states?
Over the years, Idaho is consistently in the top 10 states for our rate of suicide. In the last 5 years, we've had almost 2,000 people die. And then you add to that the fact that there's another 25,000 people who've attempted but not died. So we have a very serious problem, and we're in the top states in the nation.
Is there any indication why Idaho is so high when it comes to suicide?
Well, we're not alone. Other Intermountain states also have high suicide rates. And there haven't been a lot of studies on that, but we think that it may be related to climate or access to care issues or even our self-reliant culture.
I can see how that could play a part into it. Many people who are contemplating suicide don't seek help. Let's talk a little bit about the stigma surrounding suicide and how that plays into this fact.
Well, what stigma is a pervasive and serious stereotype about someone because of who they are. So a person may have a mental illness and be stigmatized, or a person may be suicidal, or if they die by suicide, their family may be stigmatized. And so they keep secrets. They don't share and they don't ask for help.
Is there a way to overcome that stigma?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we do at ISU is we conduct education programs for people to understand what mental health problems are and how to address suicide. And armed with that knowledge, then they understand the reasons and don't stigmatize.
Mm-hmm. Often suicide is simplified. It's portrayed as being set off by one single incident, like a suicide or maybe a job loss. But usually it's a lot more complicated than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. What we look sometimes as the reasons for a suicide, like a job loss or a relationship loss, is really just the trigger. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. And when you look back and you look at what's going on in a person's life, 90% of the time they had some sort of underlying mental health or substance abuse disorder, or both, and that underlying condition led to the suicide.
Okay. Are there warning signs that you can be looking for?
Yeah, and it's important to look for people's behaviors, because most of the time people won't tell you they're thinking of killing themselves. So we have to look for things. And so some of those is that they seem to have a lost interest in things they used to like to do. They withdraw, they talk about death or dying, or they draw pictures, or they write about it. They may talk about feeling like life is hopeless or there's no way out. And one of the things people do quite a bit is give away prized possessions.
So there are definitely things people can be looking for. If you notice some of these signs in a loved one, what should you do?
Well, the first thing I would do is call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is a crisis hotline with trained operators who can help people who are in crisis figure out a plan of action to keep themselves safe. And that number is available not only to people who are in crisis themselves, but their friends or their family members who are worried about them. They can get help too.
Okay, so that's good to know. The hotline is not just for those who are specifically contemplating suicide, but also for those loved ones who might see those signs and symptoms.
Right, it can be very helpful to them.
And this is truly vital information. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing this with us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And just one more time, for those in crisis, there is a National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-TALK. For Idahoans living on farms and in rural areas, it may be difficult to get immediate health services or reach a hospital in case of emergency. This reality makes rural nursing a vital part of the Idaho landscape. Without the luxury of specializing in specific medical disciplines like their metropolitan colleagues, a rural nurse must be a jack of all trades to meet the varying needs of their patients. Idaho State of Mind's Ramon Bailey introduces us to Deborah Sorensen, a rural nurse in McCammon, Idaho.
McCammon, Idaho has the population of 806 people. McCammon's health clinic is only open 2 days a week. One resident of this small town is Deborah Sorensen. Her role in healthcare is very important considering the resources are scarce.
Whereas where we're at, they either can afford to go or it's an emergency, they're right there. So I do the allergy injections, I do the x-rays, I do the IVs. I mean, anything pretty much that comes into the clinic right then, I have to be able to do.
Rural nursing serves an important role in their community.
You know, most of Idaho would probably be considered rural nursing with the exception of the Boise and the Boise Valley, because we do have a population that is spread very far. We have small communities, but they may be 30, 40, 50 miles apart.
The U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration awarded 2 grants for a total of $1.3 million to the Idaho State University School of Nursing. The grants went to help the rural nursing programs reach nurses across the country. Once Sorensen decided to go into nursing, she had her mind set on that career path.
I live in rural Idaho. I wanted to stay close to home.
Sorensen plans on helping out her community health clinic for many years to come. In McCammon, Idaho, Ramon Bailey, Idaho State of Mind.
It might be interesting to note Idaho is becoming less rural. Approximately 30% of Idahoans live in rural communities now compared to 40% just 20 years ago. And that's all for this edition of Idaho State of Mind. Thank you for joining us. From the campus of Idaho State University, I'm Libby Howe. We'll see you next time.